Welcome to Show Your Priors, episode number 5. On this episode, TBPN was acquired by OpenAI. What does that say about media ownership in the modern age? Will AI replace coders? Our commenters certainly don't think so. How does Xerxes fit into business strategy? We'll find out later on that. But first, we've got some headlines. Mike, let's do a quick rundown on what was happening this week. So if you didn't hear, OpenAI received a monster funding round. It was worth $122 billion, which brings their total valuation to $852 billion. Now that's with them currently generating $2 billion per month in revenue. What do you think about that one?
Well, I mean, we often talk on this show about how AI hallucinates. Maybe here the investors and the stockholders are hallucinating a little bit, right? So in preparation for the IPO is probably what we're thinking about. So is the valuation a hallucination? I don't know. But they're probably going to have to sell about a quadrillion ads to ever reach that valuation. And I think this is part of something you're going to see in AI in general is massive valuations. At least AI, OpenAI is actually producing pretty healthy revenue. But the question is, what are the costs?
Mm-hmm.
I think all of these models, for every query, they're losing money. And that's why they're pushing so hard for more compute power, right? More energy, et cetera, because it's going to require massive amount of energy, maybe to bring that, spread those costs out. And then hopefully they can become profitable over time. Doesn't seem like having a free user base is a good way to do that right now because they're essentially just costs. So that's where you're seeing the ad pressure come in. And I imagine that's their board members, of course, putting pressure on their own executives, of course, putting pressure on to find new revenue sources, et cetera. So let's see. I just know at such valuations, it's very difficult to ever produce enough cash to justify that,
Yeah.
especially when you're losing market share
Well, it's going to be
in
one of the
enterprise.
highest IPOs ever, right? SpaceX probably the only one that's going to beat it ever.
Yeah. And who knows what's going to happen if what the messaging around it's going to be, what is the business model going to be? Because you have the free ads I just mentioned. You have OpenAI losing market share to Anthropic and enterprise. I think over the last couple of years now, they've lost, I think they were at like 48%. Now they're down to 27%. And with Anthropic, they went from third to first. I think they're up, I forget what it was, like maybe 14%, then up to 40% market share. So does that mean enterprise is lost for OpenAI? I don't know. I know that at least this data, OpenAI may dispute and say they have a million plus whatever business consumers, but does that mean each user, or does it mean you have a million plus businesses, or what? Not ever clear, right? I get why they're disputing that, but it does seem there's a trend much more towards Anthropic and enterprise, and who knows what that means for OpenAI.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, so, and I was just doing some math. At 852 valuation, it would take them, 35 years at $2 billion a month of revenue to even hit that number. And that's just revenue. That's not profit. That's not net.
That's not
That's,
cash,
that's
huh?
gross. That's EBITDA, right? So it's, they're going to have to find a way to make a lot of money quick. But on that same note, and going into enterprise, Microsoft in this past week has now released its own in-house AI models covering transcription, voice, and image generation, presumably to reduce their dependence or exposure to OpenAI, because OpenAI right now is 100% behind Copilot. They're the brain behind Copilot. So, what do you think about that? I mean, that just makes it worse for OpenAI, doesn't it?
I'm not sure. I don't know if you saw the launch of Artemis this week, right? And it
Yeah.
turns out that their Outlook doesn't even work, right? They have
Right.
two different versions of Outlook,
Yeah.
and neither one works. So let's see if Microsoft is able to deliver something that actually works
Well,
in that space. I mean, because if you're Microsoft strategically, you own enterprise channels. right? You have
Oh
people
yeah.
locked in.
Yeah.
And the question is, and I know I believe they're one of the bigger investors in OpenAI, right? I mean, we have to confirm how much. I think it was 10 billion that they put in. And that's where, as a company, you're treating them, because I used to run the corporate venture capital, you're treating OpenAI as an option. What I mean by an option is you put that 10 billion in to be, seated at the table in case you want to acquire them later. But if they're going to go off and do their own IPO, they become competition almost immediately. And so that could be putting some pressure on Microsoft. And I guarantee you those numbers you saw with Anthropic, that's putting pressure on Microsoft too, because it's not exactly clear how Copilot is performing in enterprise. I put up a post earlier in the week on LinkedIn where the original, to be fair, it was just to free users, right? Consumer
Hmm.
terms and conditions said it is for entertainment purposes only, Copilot,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, what kind of confidence does that give you if you're sitting in enterprise? Now, to be fair, those weren't the enterprise terms. But the question is, we did a little bit on how AI hallucinates and confabulates. I'm wondering how accurate that Copilot is sitting inside of enterprises. They're able to actually depend on it. And simultaneously, you hear about the Defense Department relying on Claude for, you know, pretty complicated missions.
Yeah.
So I
What
think that's a lot of the strategic stuff going on. You're just wondering, what is Microsoft doing? Are they even good at this? Or, you know,
they tried. So Microsoft did try originally to release their own models, and then they decided it would just be more effective to use OpenAI for now. So they've tried it before, and I guess it wasn't effective, or maybe they took the stance of Apple, who's kind of holding back and saying, "Well, let's just kind of see where things go for a minute," which I don't think that's. I think that kind of makes sense, honestly, with when you see how much capital
yeah,
is Apple's one
yeah.
of the. They're making great
Well,
numbers right now.
and I think this is always the question in strategy. You can do anything, but you shouldn't do everything,
Yeah,
right? And you have limited resources, limited capabilities. And if you look at Apple, because people said this is a mistake by Apple to not do a foundation model, right? Well, how many damn foundation models are there at this point?
yeah,
If you're Apple, you could just look at them as like, hey, look, I own the customers. I own the App Store, right? You're going to put your AI on my hardware eventually through phone or whatever,
hmm,
or through APIs, people accessing it through APIs and apps. I'll just own that channel and just monetize you just like I always have. And
yeah,
I'm going to sit on that channel because I own the consumers, right? So they can kind of treat Gemini and the others as partners. You go deploy all that capital, right, to develop those models, and we'll just still charge you for using the channels.
oh yeah,
Like, we're not going to deploy all that cash because maybe they recognize that's not really their forte, right? That's not really their strength strategically. Their strength is brand, hardware, ecosystem,
yeah.
right? Closed system. And
Well, they dipped their toe in with Apple Intelligence, and I don't think they got very good good feedback. So
yeah, I mean, I know Siri's been getting hammered recently, but
yeah.
hey,
So let's also move a little bit. That takes us to a couple things here. So Anthropic's leaked Claude code this week. It exposed internal detail about memory, permissions, tools, and orchestration. So that was not intentional. I did catch some posts online that were clickbait and then saying, "Hey, I was the guy responsible for this leak," and he wasn't. It was just a guy trying to get some attention and pimp his own AI product. It was actually kind of ingenious, but super sleazy. Anyways, that's beside the point.
there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that around AI and on
Yeah,
X in general, just people trying to get attention because
yeah,
it's a status platform, right?
yeah,
At the end of the day,
absolutely.
zero sum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we were looking earlier at the numbers, the usage numbers, and Claude's numbers have been going up. Anthropic, Claude's numbers have been going up, and I first heard that they were really spiking after they had their tiff with the Department of Justice or the Department of Defense when they said that they wouldn't just agree to the things that the Department of Defense was wanting them to agree to, and I it sounded like they got a pretty big usage spike out of that, and then also the ads. I think targeting OpenAI helped maybe a little bit, but they were pretty highbrow ads for people who don't know that much about AI. I think so. I kind of think it's the stance on the defense that maybe brought a lot of users over. Whatever it is, they've been having a spike. But now they've also had an employee-funded PAC, a political action committee, formed. And typically, when those things are formed, they do things like polls, they do things like research, Oppo research, and they do things like investing and political donations. So it's very much a arm of lobbying in a way. And it's the article I read on it said it was structured completely for the employees to be involved in the PAC. So not sure how it's going to play out or if it's connected to this Department of Defense contract issue, but I don't know. Kind of, what do you think there? What do you see?
Well, I think Claude's penetration or Anthropic's penetration into enterprise began before that Department of Defense. And it's because Claude Code does such a
Yeah.
good job. It's getting better and better and better, right? I think
Yeah.
everybody knows that.
Yep.
Claude's reasoning is seen as top performance,
Yep.
the reasoning capabilities, and its adaptive abilities are seen as the best. I know when I was making my strategy model, right? We'll talk about that on a later show.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that it was better than ChatGPT at reasoning through this model that I created. So I just naturally went over there. And then when I saw Claude Code, I just got hooked into the entire ecosystem. So I think they've done a really good job of building an ecosystem around the Anthropic API, Claude, their models, Opus, and Sonnet. And I think that's just convincing people. Now, the second thing that could be interesting for enterprise, particularly in Europe, is, and maybe this is why they behave like they did with the Department of Defense, they have something called their constitution. So they're really trying to at least claim that they're more about safety and responsible AI.
Mm-hmm.
And their claim was that the Department of Defense violated essentially their constitution. You can fact check me on that. But the spat was around that. Now, that's a branding move, isn't it?
Yeah,
So
for
they,
sure.
they want to they want to signal to their customers that they are consistent about their constitution. Now, others were claiming it was hypocrisy and all this. You can always find somebody on the other side. But what it looks like strategically is, yeah, you may have lost the Department of Defense, but maybe you're signaling to, European enterprise or whatever that you're taking that safety and AI and privacy and data very seriously because you're going to have to succeed in Europe.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't know exactly where it's going to land. We'll find out. I think at the end of the day, it's not going to matter a whole lot because I think everything's going to be open source. And I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical of all this big spending because of models. The Chinese models we've seen that have come out have been completely open source, accomplish things for a lot cheaper. I just don't think we know what the final vision is going to be yet. So I don't know.
Well,
I don't hate their stance. I think it's a good stance to have.
now,
But
yeah, one reason you might lobby, right, and I think we're already seeing hints of this, is to prevent those open models from competing against you,
true. Very true. Very true.
right? Because you have all the lawyers, you have the ears of the politicians, right? And you can spend the big bucks and write the laws. Now, people call that corruption, or is it just smart, right? To influence the laws, to lobby, so that it'll be cast, of course, as AI safety and make sure that data is protected and all this. But at the end of the day, those are regulatory costs for newcomers.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the open source models can compete. And in this case, if they're Chinese models, at least with the current administration, who knows about future ones, you could probably easily sell them on blocking those models for national security reasons, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the story is just there to be written.
Oh, for sure.
But it does bring up something because I know that for our model, for example, when we're talking to venture capitalists, they're all concerned about being commoditized by Claude, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, when its reasoning capabilities get really good, your model's in trouble, right? And that's a fair assessment. But then you brought up something. Well, what happens when you have open source models competing against Claude and it gets good enough,
Yeah.
not perfect,
That's Microsoft play.
but
It's good enough.
yeah, it's good. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
and you have the channels, right? But when it's good enough and it's open source for most people,
Yeah.
who knows if you're going to have the pricing power as Anthropic or OpenAI to justify those valuations and ever
Exactly.
reach that revenue, right? I
Yeah.
mean, and that I think that gets us to one of our other stories out there, the release of Gemma, right?
Yeah.
By
Google.
Google.
Yep.
And what do you think about that? What do you think? I mean, we just talked about open source.
Yeah.
Maybe explain what Gemma is, and then I'll
Yeah.
give you my.
I mean, Gemma is just a Raspberry Pi compatible open source model, which means it can be deployed in very small. Raspberry Pi is a very small motherboard type
So
computer,
hardware. Yeah.
small computer, and so it can be deployed in very small instances. Now, the main competitor in this space is Meta, who's had Llama. Llama's been the number one open source coding large language model since the beginning, almost. And it's been used exclusively amongst home coders or people trying to homebrew or startup companies, that kind of thing. It's been almost Llama completely. So now they're gonna have a competitor, and I think that's great. I think that's fine. Everyone wants competition. Now, what does it mean, competition in the free space? I'm not exactly sure, because Google also has Gemini, which is a paid model. So I'm not exactly sure what that's about. I haven't really thought about that too much, honestly.
All right, let me give you a take. I think probably the Chinese models you were mentioning was a
DeepSeek.
threat.
Yeah.
It's a threat
Yeah.
to the paid models, to Gemini 3, 4, when it comes, right? And then you have OpenAI, the latest one, I think is 5.4,
Yeah.
5.5, whatever. Then Opus 4.6. Those are expensive to run, and these Chinese models are starting to gain traction. They're getting good enough.
Makes
That's the
sense.
reality.
Yep.
I think it's like, I forget what the traction is. I don't want to make up numbers like AI does, but but if you're Google, you see that. And
Yeah.
Google has its own ecosystem, right? It has Gemini, it has Google Cloud, it has Android, it has Pixel, it has all this stuff, right? And what I think this is probably about, one is to tamp down, at least stem the tide of those Chinese models by putting Google's brand name behind it.
Yeah.
But here's the other thing. If you start developing with Google stuff, and they do this as an open source, people are like, why would you do that? Well, do you know what a loss leader is?
No, explain.
A loss leader is something that you give away either at cost or at a loss so that you can generate revenue somewhere else. So
Yep.
one of the classic examples is like HP, the printers. The printers, you go in there and you're like, damn, this printer's like $30.
Yeah.
The cartridge is $50, right? Each time you replace, I don't know if those are the numbers, but they give away that printer basically at cost so
Yeah.
they can generate all the revenue on the consumables. Okay, now if you relate that to Google, that maybe they're giving away this open source model, Gemma 4, to as a loss leader to create a funnel into Google Cloud,
Yeah.
Android, and the rest, right? So it's a funnel into like this $17 billion business. And who knows how ads might relate to that. Um, there's the language support in there. There's audio and visual in this Gemma 4, the ability to process that kind of stuff. That could be a game changer for certain people. It also means, well, if you're good enough, why do I need to constantly, if I'm building an application, why do I need to constantly pay Claude's and Anthropic's API costs when I can put this local model on at no cost essentially, right? I
Yeah.
have to train it maybe and host it somewhere,
Yeah.
but it's not going to rack up the same bill as you are with Claude.
Yeah. One more quick one before we move on to our main topic. Oracle had mass layoffs this week, between 20,000 and 30,000 employees, via an unsympathetic, terse was the word that I actually read, terse email signed by Oracle leadership. Oracle stock has fallen 54% since its peak in September. So a little bit about Oracle, if you're not familiar with them, they build a lot of these data centers. So when NVIDIA goes to OpenAI, and OpenAI goes to Oracle to build the data centers. So Oracle has a lot of data center builds ongoing right now that are unfunded, from what I've been reading, leading to this 54% decline since its peak in September on the stock. So it kind of is an indication, I think, in just uncertainty of the funding, or an indicator of the AI bubble, which I think is probably going to happen. I think the bubble is going to burst at some point here, and I think Oracle's going to have to bear the brunt of that for a while. But in that same regard, their CEO is an Ellison, and he's got really good lobbying skills. So I have a feeling at the end of the day they're going to be fine, but I think they will bear a brunt of the of the bubble because they're the company doing most of the infrastructure building here. Ultimately, I think they'll be okay in the end, but we'll have to see. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those courageous leadership emails where nobody is responsible for the email, but everybody's responsible,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we're going to deliver bad news as a group, take accountability. Notice how the accountability only runs downwards,
Oh
not
yeah.
upwards, right?
Always.
Um,
Always does.
and if you caused your stock to drop 54%, now we know the market has a lot to do with that, the
Yeah.
things going on in the world, of course. Um, they can't control the speed of data centers. Maybe they've run into some funding issues. Okay. But if you cause your stock to drop 54%, why are you not accountable for that? Why aren't
Right.
you going first?
No.
You know what I mean? I mean, that's how people below are getting let go. I guarantee you they're thinking that way. Why are you letting me go?
Yeah.
Like, I'm doing actual work here. You're just, where's the strategy here?
Well,
You know?
they say the war is a rich man's fight, and we send the poor in to for profit. And I'm just using that in the allegory to the employer and the employee.
Yeah.
However, I kind of think so. Now, this money is earmarked that they're going to save from getting rid of these employees is already earmarked for the infrastructure builds. But I do think this speaks to a larger trend that's going on in the market right now, and that is that a lot of these layoffs that we've seen a ton by every sector, flagged as AI layoffs, have been more in response possibly to tariffs, to bad market, uncertain conditions under this administration, stuff like that. So I do think that a lot of that plays in as well as just general economy, as not just
Well,
maybe necessarily AI projects.
let me give you the general incentive that you always have as an executive is to hit your annual EBIT target,
Yeah.
right? The fastest way to move that is just to cut headcount.
Yeah.
It's the easiest
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Have I ever told you the story about the private equity company that took over Kraft Heinz?
I think so,
Well,
but say it again.
maybe it's in another video, but I think this is very similar context, right? So a lot of people are starting to look at these AI cuts as because they're trying to figure out is AI increasing productivity or are people just using it as an excuse to fire people,
Yeah.
right? Now, so your fastest way to hit your EBIT target, as I said, is to get rid of headcount. But there's a danger in this. And one of the most famous was, I think it was called 3G Capital, backed by Warren Buffett. They merged Kraft Heinz. And you know what PEs do, right? They come in and they basically cut costs everywhere. So
Yeah.
that was a
For sure.
strategy here, was just to cut costs across the board. They cut their R&D to like half of the competition and then the marketing to like a third in a CPG game, right? Like in a game where branding matters a hell of a lot. So they did that, and then it led to bleeding, bleeding, bleeding. So the point is, when you cut, and this is the question, what headcount are you cutting? How does it relate to your business model? And a lot of times people cut things that actually matter a hell of a lot to their business model, but the bill comes due later,
Yeah. Yep.
sometimes after that leadership is gone already. So
Yeah.
they get their millions, then the bill comes due, stock starts to crash, then you have to fire even more people because you basically undercut the foundations of your business model.
Yeah.
So I think that's always, now that does not mean that corporate does not get too fat, right? There is a tendency in corporate to blow up headcount because headcount is a proxy for power and resources in corporations.
Yeah.
The more headcount you have, the more power you're going to get, the more status you get. Now, HR will tell you headcount doesn't matter, right? But everybody in every company in the world knows headcount matters. And every time you apply to a job, what is the first question you get? What is it? It's not, are you a good learner, right? It's not, are you, well,
Well,
entrepreneurial, we can talk
what's the
about,
largest
but
headcount you've managed?
exactly,
Yeah.
that's it. That's all they want to know. Why do they want to know that? Because it's a proxy for your political skills.
Yeah.
Were you able to navigate kiss ass properly and get
Hmm.
up the chain and get enough people and power and resources?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you're actually talented at what you do. They never go ask that head count if you're actually an effective leader.
For sure.
So, and then the other one I like to riff on is, I just said they ask if you're entrepreneurial, and my joke there is, well, yeah, first business idea you get, I'm out of here. They don't hire you.
No,
They
that's a
don't want
that's a
actual entrepreneurs.
that's
They
a
want you to
that's a
pretend to
silly
be an
question.
entrepreneur.
It's a silly question
Yeah.
for an interview. Anyways, we need to at one point discuss CEO pay structure and or
Yeah,
leadership
yeah.
pay structure. I think it's a very would be something really interesting to dissect and see why some of these decisions are made for the short term and why they might be beneficial for a higher ups pay package, but
No,
longer term it might shoot
we
you in the
should
foot.
definitely discuss that because I talk about it in my upcoming book that there's been virtually no innovation around governance.
Yeah, yeah,
And, I don't know if you caught it, but Zuckerberg said he's training an AI to make some of his decisions. Well, the impression I get when I get an email from a CEO that's clearly written by one of the LLMs.
yeah. Well,
It's like, why do I need you?
yeah.
And you can be damn sure that young people are thinking that, like,
Oh, for
why
sure.
don't we just put Claude
Yeah.
in charge
No,
if
there's
he's
yeah.
writing your emails,
There's a
right?
reason. There's a reason that the manager's office wants you want the manager's office behind closed door, and that's so you can't see the employees can't see when the manager's goofing off or not doing anything,
That's right.
because
That's
it
right.
ruins morale. Yeah, absolutely. I
But
completely
we'll
agree.
come to that. I mean, we'll go through, I think, a lot of the chapters of
Yeah,
my book eventually. Um, but that's a big topic, and I really wonder when some innovation around the governance at the top,
yeah,
especially now that you can get information on the fly, will get better,
yep.
like BS detectors, when the board starts acting like a board and actually governing. Let's see. I would hope there's some innovation with AI in that direction.
I hope so. I bet we'll see some eventually here. Well, let's move on to our main topic here, and that was that TBPN was acquired by OpenAI this past week. And if you're not familiar with TBPN, they're a business podcast. It's daily, 5 days a week, 3-hour show. Right in the middle of the day. They were very popular amongst those in Silicon Valley, those in venture capital, startups, that type of thing. So they had the right eyeballs. They only had like 60,000 subscribers on YouTube, for example. They did have a large Twitter following, X following of about 350K, something like that. But when you go back and look at their views, now you can't see Spotify views like the podcast listens on Apple Podcasts and stuff. So I bet those are substantially higher than their YouTube views. But just looking at those, they were purchased for $100 million plus.
Yeah.
Was what they were purchased for by OpenAI. Sam Altman put out a tweet that said, I really like the show. That's why it's my favorite show. That's why I bought it. But it does say something, I think, to Benjamin Franklin owning ink, owning the printing press. Like you own your own ink, you can make the news, control the news. And it seems to be a vanity right now for the ultra wealthy to own some sort of media, some sort of news. We've got Bezos, who owns, was it the Times? Does he own the New York Times or the Post? One of the two, or maybe it's the Washington Post. He owns one of those. But Bezos owns traditional media. You've got Ellison, who's have CBS News now merging with CNN. They're going to merge those two organizations together now.
Hey,
You've got
didn't
this.
didn't GE? I think GE bought NBC in the past, right?
I
Comcast,
think so.
whatever.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
Comcast.
that
Yeah,
failed.
yeah. No, it failed. Well, and the thing is, right now, is that everyone's jamming these mergers through because the administration is open to it. In the past, a lot of these might have been considered monopolies, which is another topic. But you see a lot of that in the traditional media side. There's a lot of ownership there, and then the new kids on the block have the new media, which is social media, which is your Facebook, your X, your TikTok. I mean, those are all the new media sources, anything that you have eyeballs in front of you. So there is a lot of these vanity ownership. So it kind of opens the door for the questions of, well, how's this podcast going to be used in regard to OpenAI? Well, obviously they're not going to tell you bad stuff about OpenAI. Maybe they will a little bit here and there, but I imagine, knowing a little bit about history and how those type of things go, that they may have the freedom to speak on that stuff at the beginning, and I imagine it will gradually get clamped down until
Well,
like
even
a,
if
a
they,
frog boiling in a pot of water.
yeah, even if they were able to manage it and criticize their own entity, who knows what the listeners will believe, right? I think it just erodes the trust.
Yeah,
I guess the test would be like, will you still have a Google executive on or a Claude executive on? I mean, Altman and Dario, right? They couldn't even shake hands or hold hands at that summit. I don't know if you saw the pictures on that. Like, will they invite each? Will he be invited on to go onto the show. I have bigger problems with this. Just his statement alone that he bought it because he likes it. You know, if I were on that board, I would have killed that because you when you acquire something, right? M&A fails like 70 to 90%. And I will then question whether this is actually M&A, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? They can't even like,
What?
is he going to invite him on the show? Or are they going to invite him
What
on
a
the
nerdy feud. I mean, imagine the
show?
cage fight on that one, though.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay. Funny.
Yeah. So you're on the board and you look at this and you're thinking, okay, M&A fails at 79%. The main reason typically is that your cultures don't match, which is usually downstream from your business models don't match. OpenAI is not a media company.
Yeah.
So you just wonder right out of the box, hey, how will this ever work? What is the business model here? How much they making 2 billion per month? This show's making like 5 million a year
Yeah.
just through advertisements. They're going to drop the
Well, to be
advertisements.
fair, okay, so I have another theory here, and to be fair, so they put up
Yeah.
some really big numbers in the matter. The show's 11 months old. I left that piece out. They're a very young endeavor, only 11, 12 months old, and they're already bringing
Yeah.
in 5 million a year in ad revenue. That's crazy, and it's because they had the right eyeballs. Like they had expensive eyeballs, the people who are investing
Yeah.
and buying things. So
But their success doesn't mean they'll be successful together,
yeah,
right? I
fair.
mean, that's the whole point of M&A is that jointly you'll create more value than you could have on your own. I know they were projecting they grow to like 30 million very soon too.
Yeah,
Probably. I would also question one way you might say this M&A can make sense is you get eyeballs that will be your customers. I don't know if that's true. I don't know in the due diligence if they check are the subscribers actually people who would pay for OpenAI. Now, what could this also be about? I think it's going to be about controlling the narrative leading up to the IPO. Right?
yeah,
That's if
sure,
you ask me.
yeah,
That makes sense. So actually, maybe this is simply a marketing expense that you paid an M&A premium for.
yeah. If they
Now,
have,
I wouldn't do that as a board, right? I
yeah,
think that tells me maybe you have too much cash,
yeah,
right? That you're spending it on a vanity project. But maybe there's a marketing strategy there. I saw some other X reactions like this is the next big thing in media, and every move these people are making, everybody predicts it's going to change the game.
right,
I would bring you back to the priors, right? The base rates for M&A, 70 to 90% failure to achieve the projected value together.
yep,
Maybe I'm wrong, but those are the base rates. Maybe they'll beat them,
well,
right? And this is a startup.
yeah,
If you 11, 12 months old, they got good traction, better than most startups in the world, right? And the base rate for succeeding as a startup is, what, 90% failure rate.
yeah.
So you combine the M&A failure rate with the startup failure rate, two business models that don't match, then you just wonder, and it wasn't it, didn't they get rid of Sora like
Yeah,
earlier in the week?
Sora's gone. Yeah,
Yeah, so they did that. What was the statement? To create more focus, fewer distractions,
I think
and
it was to free up resources. Yeah,
then you go buy a distraction.
yeah,
Well, presumably it looks like a distraction,
right.
right? I don't know. Again, I'm not going to say this will fail. I'm just going to say base rates don't look good, and it's a little bit suspicious from the business model perspective. How do these actually match?
Yeah.
And are you going to make a play in media, or is this just I like the show, therefore I spent my shareholders' money?
So I have a couple theories. You're making some good points for sure. I have a couple of my own theories. One is that their audience is likely comprised of some hedge fund managers who are going to be investing in stocks, so the IPO route makes sense. There are some efforts in play right now to get IPOs inside. So if you're not familiar with index funds and index investing, it's a way of buying a broad swath of the market. You can buy a total market fund, you can buy an S&P 500 fund, and they're weighted based on the size of the companies. So these new IPOs with SpaceX and OpenAI coming up for being a public company now bring up an interesting question, because they're immediately going to be bigger than a bunch of the companies that are inside of these index funds. And once you're inside of an index fund, your cash flow is going to go up, because there's people just passively now investing their 401k money in you. That's how I invest as index funds. So you're immediately getting some inflow of cash. So it brings up an interesting question. There are rules right now around how quickly an IPO'd company can end up in these funds. And there's a lot of pressure right now to quicken that pace to get these companies in there quicker. So, a little bit of lobbying, a little bit of, getting in front of the right eyes, I think is involved in there. And I also kind of do believe that at some point we are going to have some sort of AI media companies where media information, it's something that these AIs are really good at is combing for data. So looking at, X.com and getting the latest tweets, the most viewed, the most commented, whatever. You could have a news AI bot, talk about stuff like that.
Make sure it's real what it's bringing back.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're not perfect, yes, but I think we will get to the point where they'll be good enough. As good as people, right? People make mistakes too. So I think they'll have an error rate around humans at some point, and these guys could be a really good path to consultanship because they built something impressive within a year. For sure. So I don't want to take that away from
Are you saying there's human slop out there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of ties in directly into our next topic, which is will AI replace coders? And we've had a number of comments on will AI replace coders, so we wanted to kind of touch on this. And honestly, the question is,
the comment was just very.
The answer is
the comment was very straightforward. Well, let's be fair. Right? Because when I was commenting on it, I was saying AI can basically code.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's Claude Code, and there are other ones out there that are coding, right? Essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Now, somebody who's in coding, I would guess, has a sort of bias that what they do is an art, it's a craft, and they can't be replaced because it's super critical to the mission. Go into any corporate department, every department thinks they're more important than the next department, right? That's just part of, that's probably natural that you believe that your role is the most important. So, but let's be fair. For someone, for people like us, AI can code. You know why? Because it codes a hell of a lot better than we can.
Yep.
The learning curve to do it on our own, now I've taught myself to code a little bit, just enough to be dangerous. AI can extend my ramp much farther than I ever could have done it before.
For sure.
I can get up a prototype in a week. I can get up a web page overnight, and it's all done, right? Now, the code that was generated there, right? A proper software engineer will faint if they have to read it, right? Because they look at it. Now, that doesn't mean human code doesn't have bugs and errors and contradictions and
exactly.
it's just badly formatted. It just means that AI pumps out a lot of code that nobody's really looking at.
Yep.
They're just thinking, oh, it's done, good enough, let's go. Now that may work for a consumer-facing app or for a web page, right? Or like I'm making my own little game just to get it prototyped and get it ready. It clearly can already code, right?
For sure.
I think what people are saying when they're pushing back, and I think this is fair, is, but how would that work in enterprise? What about the security, right? Is it efficient? Can it scale if you start to get a lot of users? And the answer is probably, we don't know, probably not, right? And you can't just go to an enterprise IT department and say, hey, I vibe coded this, be my customer. And they ask you, well, how does it work? I don't know. I don't know. I haven't even looked at the code. I can't tell you. And I think that's fair for people to push back there. That what that then means is you still need software engineers to do the scaling, the infrastructure, the security, if you want to have any hope of doing an enterprise business. Because there's just no way risk-averse corporate people are going to allow something in that is not transparent, right? And in the EU, it's going to be especially this way. If you can't tell me down to the last dot what's in there and how it works, you're going to be in trouble.
I agree with you on most of your points. I do think that AI coders need oversight right now. And what we're seeing in the real world right now is that junior level coders aren't getting hired. It's getting increasingly hard for a junior level coder, someone right out of school, to get a job. Now, the people who already have jobs largely are probably okay, but and that's because they're able to now monitor. They would have to monitor junior level coders anyway. So why not just monitor the AI and what it's doing? It
That
seems
could, I
like a
mean,
lot more cost
that's a
effective.
fair point. And I wonder if that not hiring junior coders is just not hiring junior people in general, because
I think so. I mean,
that's part of that trend. And I think it's partly because people don't know, especially executives. I don't think they have any idea what AI can do.
no.
They're just they just see it as again a way to lower the headcount, increase efficiency,
Yep.
but I'm not sure they understand how to actually deploy it to achieve more productivity efficiency. And from what I've talked to a few CFOs on this, they don't see they don't see it in the numbers yet. So I would guess that enterprises are going to figure out they probably have to bring some of those junior coders back, if anything, because those senior ones don't want their eyes bleeding, right? Looking at all that code, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the role changes, but it's clear that something is happening on the coding side where AI can actually accomplish a lot. It gets you there faster, right? It gets you to prototype, to something that you can release a little bit faster. But is it production ready? I don't think so, right? At least the thing I
Yeah.
made, I would not trust it as a corporate customer of it. But now that I have proper software engineers, you can definitely trust it, right? It's
Well, it lends itself, and I think you're right. It is more than just coders. It's anything that is dealing with large strings of text. So, attorneys' offices, for instance. Now, I know you can't get legal advice from an AI legally in some states, but at attorneys' offices, instead of a paralegal to review contracts or search for contract law, AI is a pretty good bet to pull some stuff forward that your paralegal might pull forward in front of you anyway, and do it at a lot cheaper rate, $24 a month versus versus whatever you have to pay a paralegal. So I think in that regard, it's very similar to that, because code is same thing as written language. I mean, it's a written language. It's no ifs, ands,
right.
or buts about it. Now, the stuff that I think you're talking about is, maybe it doesn't notate as well. It doesn't put notes. If you're not familiar with coding, there's the actual code that performs things, but then there's a lot of notations that go into it in order for engineers to go back and look at this code and determine what's happening. So it probably doesn't do that 100% well, but you can train it.
Well, have you noticed, and I think this is probably going to be true in the code as well, when you ask Claude, for example, a question, it's like voluminous, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a lot of text coming back. And I'm wondering, and I've heard some coders say this, it's just actually producing too much code. And maybe it's unnecessary. And then if you have a lot of that going on, there'll be unpredictable bugs.
Sure.
There's
Yeah.
also the problem that, and people have run into this, it tells you it's searching for bugs, but doesn't actually look because it's lying to you.
Yeah.
Or it's telling you it created some feature that doesn't actually exist. So you still have to actually check all that. That's the point, right? And
Yeah.
I think law is a good example. And there's a lot of slop on the human side. We said that. But this AI slop has this tendency to have this extra stuff in it, security bug, maybe bugs that we're not aware of, right? And I'm guessing, and hallucinations, right? In the case of the legal cases, right, that went to Supreme Courts and high courts, and the lawyers get sanctioned for using cases that didn't exist, I bet you there's going to be a business in verification and audit.
Yeah.
It's going to be verifying and auditing that this AI produced code, or just AI products in general, that there's going to be a business around making sure that it's secure, that it's accurate, because as of now, my trust in base model output is very low
Yeah.
based on, I mean, we just watched a TikTok video about one of the models claiming it could do mathematical calculations when it cannot,
Right.
right? So that's a big problem still that I don't think is properly addressed. And maybe there's a business there. Maybe the foundation models will be able to do it. But I think one of the issues is these models by nature are stochastic. You know what stochastic means? Like probabilistic.
Hmm.
So because they're probabilistic, they're going to have error in them. And because of that, it's probably always going to be there. It's just inherent in the models. On the one hand, that's good, makes them creative, especially on speculative things. That's why Microsoft put in for entertainment purposes only, because
Right.
you can't control that probability distribution very well.
Yep.
So, because that's inherent in the technology, I'm just guessing that there's always going to be an opportunity to do this verification and audit. Just my guess. So I would, because that's a pain, right? If you launch one of these, and I think this is going to come, this is just a guess. Let's say I am guessing there will be product liability suits for some of this vibe coded stuff where people just released it,
Yeah, for sure.
and then it causes damage to someone. And I'm not discouraging people from vibe coding things, but be aware
Yeah.
that if you're releasing this stuff, the law is going to be new, but the law is usually going to be against you on that, right? If you've released something into the wild and you didn't do proper due diligence on security, etc.,
Yeah.
you're going to be in trouble,
It brings
right?
back to mind, the McDonald's hot coffee incident lawsuit.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, there was this case, I don't know the name of it anymore. It was a Canadian airline, and they were using a chatbot.
mhm.
It was their own employee, I think, was asking about severance, and the chatbot lied to it, lied to the employee about the severance, and then when I think it was about when they could file,
Yeah.
and they ended up being late or missed some deadline or whatever, and then they sued the airline, and the airline said, "Well, we can't be responsible for a chatbot, right?" And the court says, "Oh, yes, you can." Yeah. And I think that's probably correct, right? Like that's how most of product liability works. If you're putting something out there to the customers and it damages them, that's
Yeah.
on you.
No, I completely agree. But that,
Yeah,
it's still the same rules exist for humans. I mean,
that's
humans
right.
humans
That's right.
err and humans make mistakes and humans put stuff out there that harms other people. So,
But my
um,
point is, I think it's controversial right now. AI is early.
yeah,
I think it gets you in the habit of just not checking.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah,
Like, am I really, especially, amateurs like us, if we're vibe coding something, I don't even know what I'm looking at.
right.
So, right. So how many people out there are doing that? And even coders, they may have a clue what they're looking at, but they're not going to spend the time to read thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code probably.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's the problem. That is producing so much code, billions of lines of code that nobody's checking. Maybe it's doing a good job, but how much would you bet on
No, I wouldn't bet anything on it. I
that?
mean,
Yeah.
I don't think that one's on Polymarket yet, but we can maybe I'll keep my eye on
They
it.
we should put one on there like first $1 billion payout in a lawsuit due to vibe coded AI. I don't know.
Yeah, but we can. I think you have to be something called the market maker to make your own. Anyways, I
Yeah.
looked into that a little bit. It's interesting, and they're getting sued a lot. These prediction markets. Anyway, that's a different topic. I don't know. It's not going to replace coders in the long run
Not fully.
completely ever.
Not fully.
Not fully. Not
I'm a
fully.
big believer, my personal philosophy is you should use AI not to displace people, but to augment them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like it
Well.
should make you better at what you do, more creative, more productive, more efficient,
Yeah.
not replace you.
Yeah.
Because I think if you put it in the hands of somebody who's creative, they can do a lot of damage, right? Like for the good.
Yeah. Well, to
Right.
throw your own words back at you from something I think you said in our first episode is that efficiency is a code word for headcount. Cut your
Yes.
headcount.
Yes.
So in a way, you're going to use it to augment, which is going to replace some lower level people that you don't need anymore. I think that's just the way
Maybe,
it's going to go.
maybe, but at least in corporate, if you're, let's say you're not the manager, but you're below the manager, and you're using it basically just to make your life better.
Yeah.
You have to realize that manager still does not have an incentive to get rid of you
No.
unless corporate is forcing. Because why?
Well, yeah.
Because you are part of that manager's power base.
Yeah.
You're
Well,
part of the status of that manager.
the way that I think it's going to go and the way that it went for companies that I've been at is they cut headcount and ask questions later. So they'll
Yeah.
cut headcounts. You call it a pruning. You grow back stronger, whatever. But You cut the headcount first, and then you start negotiating with your directors and your managers as to how many people they actually need. And it's a bit of negotiation, and you kind of got to push them and find out the real answer. And that's really the kind of the way they do it is they cut first, and then they work their way back up to something that's working well. And it will, in the end, cost some jobs. I think we'll level out, and I think there'll be jobs in new industries doing new jobs because of AI. Just like that old story of the elevator operator, which I think got cut out of our first episode. I told this beautiful story about the elevator operator and how he was out of his job.
Elon also made a reference to that this week.
Oh, did he? Yeah.
That people used to be afraid of not having that elevator operator on there.
Yeah, it's terrifying. Like, who's gonna? It's just gonna stop itself at my floor? Crazy. But then that guy got a new job.
I have to admit, I know it's low probability. I do have to admit, I would not want to ever get stuck in an elevator.
No, no, absolutely not.
I always wonder that.
Yeah.
Especially when I was in Russia, those elevators, you were never sure if they'd make it to the top or drop, whatever.
Well, I can tell you. I can tell you.
But I was worried about it a little bit.
Having worked in telecom, all these buildings are legally required to have those telephones hooked up to a service that works, and not all of them do. So
Well, I was going to say, if it's an electrical failure that causes the elevator to stop, is that also?
I mean, that true. They're supposed to be independent systems. They used to be, but now things are changing because landlines are going away and they're too expensive. So yeah, they're gonna have to be some generator stuff involved. Well, I don't know. That's a whole.
Bring back the elevator operator.
You might. I don't know. Is he gonna? Maybe he knows how to get out. Maybe he's specially trained on how to escape the elevator.
I find this insane. Some states, I don't know if it's still true. I think New Jersey was one, Oregon maybe. They actually require somebody to pump your gas for you.
Oh, that's a state law? Yeah, I've heard that, I think.
Yeah, that's still amazing to me that exists. But that used to be the model.
Well,
right?
Yeah. So
you could justify that through service. Like, I want to have somebody there who pumps it for me as a service.
Yeah.
But this is actually what's required.
So every time there's a spike in oil prices, I'll see these rage bait videos. They have to be rage bait. They can't be real. But it'll be somebody sitting in their car at a gas station filming the girl, always a girl, at the pump in front of them. And she is filling up plastic bags and putting them into the back of her Subaru. Like plastic bags full of oil or gas. And putting it in the back of her Subaru because she wants to buy it now before the price goes up.
She's a prepper.
She's a prepper. and not a way that you should transport any type of fuel or flammable. You shouldn't do that ever. And they have to be ready. They have to be ready.
But you remember
this. Do that.
You remember that before COVID, though, right? Like in Germany, everyone bought all the toilet paper.
Oh, yeah. Well, they
I don't know what they were imagining was going to happen, but
we ran out of toilet paper here too.
Yeah.
I know the paper goods at my supermarket were out of stock. I don't know. People do some crazy things, but I think nowadays it's just the rage bait. There's this guy on TikTok, man. I've been scrolling through some TikToks lately. There's this guy called Overspray J, who's just he goes, if it's less than 100, and he's talking about 100 sprays of cologne. If it's less than 100. Like you're not even applying. Like that's his thing. And so he sprays himself over 100 times with this cologne, expensive cologne. It's just rage. It's just rage baiting to get views and attention. It works. I think it's
freaking. It works. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. Anyways.
Well,
anyway, shout out to Overspray J.
I'll do a nerdy thing here. Like, why do you think we're so attracted to rage bait?
When I get set off, I'll open that comment thing and I'll just type out everything that I want to say about that subject that's been building up for months and months and years. When I finally get triggered by that perfect thing, it has to come out. Now, I have the capability of reading it and like a sensible person deleting it and trying not to interact with it when I can. But most people don't. Most people just hit send these days.
Well, in the news, they always have this line, if it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And I think this is like evolution, that we tend to overly focus on negative things with a lot of downside because the cost of being wrong about that is like death.
Yeah.
And so we're just not interested very much in things that are, good, because what does it hurt you if you're wrong about something being good? It doesn't. There's actually no risk. No. But if you're wrong, one guy gave this example, hey, if you see a shadow behind a rock, the person who went and checked that is no longer here. Right?
Oh,
Like the right. So we're
yeah,
programmed to freak out about things like the shadow behind the rock. Because the person who went and checked, if there was a lion back there,
yeah,
that person's genes did not get, promulgated to the next generation.
right.
So the people that did survive did not check. Yeah. And so that's why we're so afraid of sharks at the ocean, even though the probability of that is almost nothing. It's the same, it's the same with airplanes. The probability of it is nothing, but
Yeah,
you can be sure if one does crash, we're attracted to that story.
yeah. Nuclear power, same thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, it's
So
less killed less people overall than coal
I think
mining.
it's just pre-programmed into us to,
Yeah,
to like drama. And I think rage bait plays on that because a lot of times, like you just said, the thing that is causing the rage just actually never really happens. It's very low probability. And that's why we overreact to it.
I agree. And I feel like a lot of people these days, like you said, aren't. What are you going to lose by looking at it or reacting to it? As I get older, the thing you're going to lose is your time. So
Yes.
every day that I get older, the more I value my time and what I want to spend it on, and I realize how I've been wasting a lot of it, and I'm like, oh no, I'm never getting that back. So it may change your view someday. You might think about what you're spending your time on, and
Well,
you only get so much of it in your life.
you may be losing a bit of your soul, like Dorian Gray on the last one, every time you respond to obvious rage bait.
Yeah, you might be. Let's transition. Speaking of rage bait, have you heard of Xerxes? I
Xerxes.
don't know if that transition works, but we're gonna go with it. I think that he was a master of asymmetrical cost, maybe.
Asymmetrical cost, asymmetric cost. So, do you remember the movie 300?
Yes, it's a great movie. Zack Snyder,
Yeah,
banger.
and there's the meme, this is Sparta, right? Where
Yeah.
the messenger comes from Xerxes and presenting Sparta with an offer it can't refuse. And
Hmm.
well, Sparta actually refused it. So let me give a little bit of background to that. We're going to talk a little bit about strategy. In the Greek world, the person who tells this story is Herodotus. And in the Greek world, you know the greatest sin in the Greek world?
No, what is it?
Hubris. You know what hubris
Oh,
is?
yeah.
Arrogance.
Essentially,
Arrogance,
I guess
right?
pride.
So
Yeah.
it's basically believing yourself a god. Now, this is the depiction of Xerxes
In the movie.
in
Yeah.
that movie.
Yeah.
He seems to, I think he even says it in the movie, I am a living god.
Yes.
That's
Yep.
something that the Greeks would have portrayed him as saying for sure. And there's this scene in there. So this is the moral side of the story, right? The Greeks have this whole view of the world that the worst thing you can do is imagine yourself as a god, and you have to always see yourself below the gods, right? So it's hubris to
Hmm.
think yourself a god.
Yeah.
So this whole story is laced with that. And there's even this scene early um, where Xerxes is building the first bridge across what's called the Hellespont, right? It's a strait to get over to from Persia, modern day Iran,
Hmm.
hint hint, right?
Yep.
So to Greece, and it fails. And there's this scene there, whether it's real or not, I don't know, but Xerxes basically commands his people to whip the sea,
Hmm.
right? So this is an example of, yeah, hubris,
Yeah.
right? That you actually believe that you're like a god, like Poseidon. You can whip the sea and it will obey your command. So, do you know the background of this war? And there's another picture on there where when Herodotus is telling this, Darius, his father, they had been at war before because you have to think of it from Persia's point of view. From Persia's point of view, Greece was a bunch of just little raggedy city states on the other side of the strait, right? On the very edge of their empire. And some of the things you don't know when you're being told this story is what actually caused this. Why would, because when it's told in Hollywood and afterwards, it's like Greece saved Western civilization,
Yeah.
right? That's the impression you get. But for Persia, it was like the city states actually aligned a lot of the times with Persia. So that kind of
Hmm.
undermines this whole story.
Yeah.
Um, and I'll get back to that.
What's
But
what Sparta was, right? Was Sparta a city state?
they were all city states at the time. You had like
Troy. Yeah.
Thebes, the Ionian city states, the Athens, Troy was on the other side, right? But so these city states, because they were so, spread out, they weren't really united. They'd have to have coalitions if they wanted to fight against Xerxes. One of them rebelled against his father, and Athens at the time provided support. And then his father lost in a battle called Marathon. So Xerxes, and you see in this picture, Athens will burn. His whole goal was to avenge his father for that rebellion and that loss at Marathon, right? And Athens, because they had helped the rebels, he wanted to punish Athens.
Hmm. Okay.
Now, getting nerdy here on the history, but so we're going to get into the asymmetric costs. So Herodotus tells you there are like millions of troops that he has to get across that bridge. He actually built a second bridge, so he didn't fail. Maybe the sea listened to him this time after he whipped it, right? But he built another bridge across. He was building a complex supply chain so that when he's sent across, they think maybe 200 to 500,000 troops, which is a lot in ancient times, to punish the city states, the Greek city states. They get across, and there's the scene at Thermopylae, right? So Thermopylae is the battle of the 300. It was more than 300 Spartans, right? But
Yeah.
that's where the
Yeah.
movie's talking about that. So Xerxes is coming across, bringing a massive land army with him, right? And he's bringing a massive navy to support,
Yep.
right? And the whole point of the story, and this is the famous story of Thermopylae, where the 300 stand against this 200, 500,000. So remember we talked about the lion and the fox. In this case, the fox is just standing, right? It's trying to force, or the right, it's trying to force that big army, which is like the lion, into a narrow pass, and let the rest of the Greek city states prepare for what's coming, at least slow them down because they're on their way into the mainland, right, to punish Athens.
Yep.
And so you get the feeling in the movie that they succeeded, right? And you feel like, and that's how it's told, they saved Greece and the Western civilization at that pass. Do you know what happened after?
It was a big war. I mean, that was
What
the.
happened after? What happened after is actually they broke through because they were betrayed, is the way the story was told,
Yeah.
and they actually went down to Athens and burned it.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
That's not in the movie
No. And
because
then.
it kind of undermines the whole thing of we beat Persia.
Yeah.
It turns out probably we don't have any many sources from Persia. From their perspective, maybe they won,
Yeah.
right? Now let's get into the asymmetric cost. So there were two battles afterwards that Greece did win, and that forced Persia back. But it had mainly accomplished its goals of punishing Athens for and getting, he avenged
Yeah.
his father's disaster at Marathon. So, okay, that's kind of suspicious. Well, why does it feel like in that movie that they saved them at Thermopylae when they actually made it down into Athens? Well, they abandoned Athens, and the most famous battle there is at Salamis, I believe it's called, where Themistocles, the head of the navy, how would you beat? We talked about this already with Napoleon. How do you beat a big military? Is you use that size against them, right? And they had a big navy, and what Themistocles was able to do was to, impossibly through deception, I think he was sending letters in some of the other city states.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the other city states had actually joined the Persians against the Spartans and the Athenians. That's also not told in the story. Why would the defenders of Western civilization choose the other side, right?
Yeah.
But he was sending somehow deceptive notes, perhaps claiming that they were going to flee the Greeks. And so then they brought in the navy, but they brought it into this narrow strait. And inside the narrow strait, the Greeks had the advantage as the foxes, right? And they had the naval skills. The Athenians were known for that. So they used that size again of the navy against it, trapped them into that narrow pass. They destroyed that navy essentially. It's a big loss for Xerxes. Xerxes was then afraid that the Greeks would sail over and destroy that bridge that he had built to cross. And if they did that, then his land army would be trapped,
Ah, yeah.
right, without supplies, right? There were two critical points there. One was using the size of the navy against them, and they were fleeing Athens, so that was part of their strategy too. They fled, they let them burn it. They didn't want to face them because they knew they would lose against those numbers in the land too. But then once the naval battle was lost, Xerxes had to pull his troops out. And then he left one general there called Mardonius, I think is his name. And then he got beat at another battle. And so, yeah, in the end, they were able to have two key victories. But it's still not clear if, from Persia's perspective, that they actually lost. They still essentially accomplished the goal of burning the city and
Right.
punishing
Yeah.
the rebellion, right? But I think it's an interesting one, given what's happening in that part of the world, to think about how what is the probability that the Greek version that we got is is true,
Pretty
right?
low. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, it's told. I mean, you always get that the victors tell the story. You're not ever sure what actually happened there, and they have the tendency in the past to exaggerate. I mean, Herodotus is considered the father of history, but still, you don't have the other side's view, and it's possible. And this is what it's possible that they both saw themselves as winning that.
for
The
sure.
Greeks like, yeah, whew, they left. They didn't destroy all of our city states, right? They
Well,
burned down Athens, but
yeah.
and then the Persians like, yeah, basically we punished them. They learned their lesson. Some of those city states are basically aligned with us. They're not going to give us any more trouble. Let's go back home to where there are actually bigger enemies on the horizon. So,
So it brings up an interest. So with today, I think what we're seeing a lot of is that both sides of conflicts aren't always going to have the same agreement as to what constitutes a victory.
that's right.
So, what may be a victory for the larger empire may not be a victory for the smaller city state who, may just have one or two guys still throwing spears and that's enough. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, and that's always a strategic question. And I came across that reading Hebrew history. I was telling you about that
Yeah.
recently. That at one point the Hebrews turned to kings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is always a question. Before they had been like little tribes, right, spread out into little cities. And when they had a war, they would collect everybody, like not conscription necessarily, but volunteer army to defend.
Yeah.
Once they went to the king, then you centralize that conscription and taxes, and you have a standing army. And the question strategically is, which one is better? It's not clear. Like, so Xerxes, when he attacked Greece, he would have to attack a bunch of different city states to take over the whole thing.
Yeah.
So that maybe is harder than just defeating one centralized capital. And so your target is clearer. And so this is always the debate, right? Do you want to have distributed power so it's harder to overtake you, or do you want to centralize it? The Hebrews centralized it, and then they lost to Assyria, and then they lost to Babylon, right? And then eventually the Persians also took over and sent them, well, returned them from exile.
Yeah.
So the question is like, what is the best model of national defense? Is it to distribute that power into local centers, or is it to have it all in one place? Because having it all in one place,
It's risky.
it's risky, right? It exposes you to if they beat that one city where all the power is in one big battle, then you're done,
Yeah.
right? And I think you see that all across history, even in the Gettysburg battle, right? For most of that war, Lee was trying to avoid those types of battles
Yeah.
with good reason,
For
right?
sure.
So yeah, that's a very good question, and it has to do with business because when you're a startup, you're more like these city states, right?
Sure.
You're trying to find a model that works for your little niche. And then the question for you is always going to be, do you want to become the big Persian Empire? right? Which comes at the cost of you might have to go fight these little nuisances on your borders. And normally they're not a threat, but there's always the threat. We went across that, we went over that with Alexander, the rise of Macedon, that little city turns into a new business model that then scales and takes over the whole territory. So I think there's always this give and take between bigness, which then has a tendency to get super bureaucratic, harder to administer the bigger it gets and the more territory it has,
Yeah.
and then remaining small, where you're more efficient, but you do have a problem if a bigger army comes against you, right? So then the trick is to stay away, right? So lion, fox again.
It's interesting how history repeats itself, and the same tactics are valuable now that were valuable then in the regards of asymmetric cost. For instance, if we look at the pager attacks by Israel, Israel was very they were tweeting out essentially how much they paid for the pager attacks on Lebanon because they were very cost effective. So it is, an act of them letting the world know that they can do these kinds of attacks very cheap. We see it right now in the Iranian conflict because, interceptors cost millions and drones may cost five
Yeah,
figures.
and it depends if both sides have different goals. Let's just roll it all the way back. Greece's goal was just to survive.
Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily to win. So if that was the standard, well, they won.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Persia's goal was just to punish them, maybe not to take over them. And
Yeah.
if that was the standard, then they won.
Yeah.
Right?
For sure.
And I think in this current conflict, that's the question. What are the actual goals? What constitutes victory?
I
Is
don't
there a
know.
situation? This is always, with proud leaders like Xerxes, I'm not going to make any references to who's who, but is there a situation where they both come out believing they won? I don't know.
Yeah, probably.
That's usually what you're trying to get to in like negotiations, right?
Yeah, I think that's the only way it ends. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But let's see. I mean, you still see it playing out that the lion can punish you. But if you can just avoid like a fox long enough,
Yeah.
maybe the lion runs out of energy, and or its supply chain gets cut, or a strait, right, gets occupied,
Yeah.
right, and that causes a strategic problem with supply of energy, for example. It wouldn't have been much different for Xerxes if that bridge had been cut off.
Exactly.
They would have been in deep trouble. So it does. I mean, studying these old ones, and we're going to do this, I think, quite a lot on the show. Just stick with us. We're going to give these classical military examples because they are relevant for business.
Yeah.
It's the same game, right? How can you use the strengths of enemies against them? How can you position yourself maybe where you both win, where you don't even face each other head on? And then we'll go through some of these classical examples of what strategy is all about. And history repeats itself. And I don't know if it's useful to look at all this history because we keep repeating the same things over and over. But maybe that's because people don't read the history.
I think it is. And I think it is. And I think there's been a trend lately of erasing history because we don't like it. And I think that's a big mistake because we need to remember even the stuff we don't like because we learn valuable lessons from it and we change going forward.
But
Hopefully.
I think for
Hopefully.
some reason, we'd have to look at the data. People are starting to revert to Roman history for some reason.
Oh,
Like
yeah. I think of the
you go
Roman
into,
Empire every day. That's a meme.
yeah, that's a meme, right? But I
Yeah.
think there's something real here. Like if you go into a Barnes and Noble, how many books on Stoicism are there?
A lot. It's
There are a
popular.
lot, right?
Yeah.
Like why is that popular? And also, there's been this trend of a return to Catholicism. I don't know if you've seen that.
I
Like,
have.
and it's not just the regular Catholic Mass, it's they want to do the old school Latin Mass, right? Well, why is that happening? And I think within Judaism there's something similar happening. But it seems like something's going on in this modern world where people are being drawn to the past for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a fan of looking at the past. I'm just wondering what that means, right?
So,
Why
yeah.
are we going back? Are we trying to look for these, timeless principles, something to hold on to during massive uncertainty. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the something to hold on to, because when you have times of uncertainty, which we seem to have a lot of now, and there's so much stimulus out there coming into our brains at all times from every angle. It makes it very loud, confusing, muddled. So if there's a singular voice that has the answer, and it's
A framework.
a framework or a set of instructions, or
Yeah.
the liturgy at a mass is a set in stone, this will lead you to salvation, that's going to be a calming voice in the noise. It's going to be something that you will tend to latch onto, and it may not even have to be the correct voice, but if it's a voice that believes what it's saying strong enough, it's going to convince enough people to. That's what happens when there's confusion.
Yeah, again,
People with the answers.
people are rushing from the uncertainty to try to find some certainty somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Indeed. Well, we'll unpack a lot more of this stuff as we go forward. I always learn a lot of stuff when Michael tells us a little bit about history, so I love that. Anyways, I appreciate you joining us tonight. That'll take up our time for this evening. Went almost an hour 20, Mike, so not too bad, but a little bit over. We'll see you next time. We appreciate you joining us. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Tell a friend about us. We're trying to expand and do this as much as we can. We really enjoy it, and we hope you do too. We'll see you next week.